Hey, Chris, thanks for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, CBC.
We appreciate everyone's attendance today with our webinar. We have joining us Chris Jow, Senior Partner Development Manager at Signifyd. My name is Signifyd. I'm Account Executive here at Zonos. And we want to have just a brief discussion with Chris to discuss fraud in international e-commerce. What we find is merchants are looking to expand global. There's a lot of times, a lot of confusion as it pertains to fraud and ways to address fraud risk. And so hopefully Chris can give us a little bit more insight into how Signifyd has helped merchants and continues to help merchants today in addressing those issues. And hopefully we can all learn from Chris today and get some additional insights. So we'll have just a brief discussion. We'll end with a little bit of Q&A at the end. And so with that being said, I just want to introduce the discussion here. One of the things that we want to certainly plug into is just some insight into the global opportunity for merchants as they look to expand global. So this is data from Shopify's Global E-commerce Playbook, where they estimate a $4.8 trillion growth in expected sales by 2021 for global cross-border e-commerce opportunity. 85% of the world's purchasing power resides outside of the US, which is huge. So it's certainly a great opportunity for organizations here in the US that are looking to expand and to build revenues outside of the borders. Here's some data from Signifyd, and Chris, maybe you can give us a little bit more insight into this. Now, this is from a report, I believe, from 2017. So the data is a little bit old, but nonetheless, still very applicable. Where along with that opportunity comes increased risks as well, and different industries, and you can kind of see here from these numbers how different industries, like the beauty industry, is affected by fraud. And so we'll be discussing different industries, different types of fraud, and how to best address those. Let's start off first with a little bit of introduction. Chris, if you want to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of introduction to Signifyd as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So Chris Jow, I work at Signifyd. I'm a partner development manager. So essentially, Signifyd is big data, machine learning, and liability shift. Okay, as lame as that sounds, I just got the buzzwords out of the way, so my marketing team will be very, very happy now. Buzzwords aside, I'll just peel back on the layers a little bit. So with typical fraud tools, they usually look at an order and provide a score. And then you as the retailer have to look at the score and decide, hey, do I want to ship this order or not? Then what happens is you might say, I'm not too sure. It kind of looks good. Maybe not. Maybe I want to do some further research, right? So it'll take a little bit of time to process the order. Or, you know what? Let me try to call the customer or email them. But what happens is that causes friction in the customer experience process and doesn't really work well for the peak seasons like holidays when you're just trying to push out as many orders as possible and you have a ton of decision fatigue and you're just worn out. So if you get a chargeback, it's sorry, you're out of luck. So when Signifyd looks at an order, if we think it's good, we'll tell you to ship it. And if we're wrong and you receive a chargeback, you don't pay for that chargeback. Signifyd does, including taxes, shipping, fees, everything. So essentially with this protection in place, you're empowered to accept every possible order because you won't have to pay that chargeback if it turns out to be fraudulent. Going back a little bit more about what Samisi was saying on the global value of cross-border e-commerce, I think it's something to note, right? Regardless of what study you look at, I think internet retailers said it was about $2.9 trillion last year, and that was like an 18% increase over 2017. But by 2022, they're looking at $5.8 trillion online. So it's about, a growth that's 6 times the rate of increase in comparison to in-store sales, right? If you look at Forrester, they say something similar where by 2020, the assumption is that 20% of all e-commerce sales will be cross-border. So it's an opportunity that most people haven't capitalized on yet. And I think the beauty of the internet, it's just really shrunk the world and reduced the distance between consumers everywhere and your store, right? a little bit of a geeky story, but think of it this way. So I lived in an area where I didn't know many people doing martial arts, and I was super fascinated by it. And not many people did the disciplines I was interested in. And so I was the geeky kid on the forums trying to learn about different martial arts and different techniques to get better at competing. And, you know, when you look at that and how the internet has brought us all together to make things very easy at the click of the button, it's really exciting. With regards to the e-commerce fraud index, VC, that you had mentioned before, it's really interesting. You know, fraud varies dramatically across different industries. Certain industries are facing similar challenges on an aggregate level, right? You got rapidly growing account takeover losses for apparel, cosmetics, and department stores. The continuing stolen financial losses for consumer electronics, furniture, and home goods. And then, of course, the growing losses from false positives for jewelry and watches, or just luxury goods for that matter, across all industries, right? So, sorry, and to step away from the geekiness.
You know, one of the things that's interesting is, you know, when we deal with merchants that are looking to expand globally, you know, usually they've got a domestic channel that's certainly growing, and they start getting, you know, they're really pushed to do international. You know, they might get customers requesting product from Canada or outside of the U.S., and so they're kind of led down that channel. But you know, just like the title of this webinar, international fraud, more risky or less. You know, a lot of times, I think there's a simplification of fraud in painting it as black and white, right? Is it risky or is it not risky? And it would be great if we could get a little bit more insight from you as to kind of the misconceptions around fraud and you know, how, just as you mentioned, you know, the difficulty in really ensuring that you're not pushing customers away while you're trying to protect yourself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, most people hear chargebacks and they think fraud right away, right? Chargebacks can break down into multiple categories, right? There are really two categories. There's the professional fraudsters, think, you know, organized crime syndicates, or consumers who abuse the chargeback process itself, right? They get a product and they put it as like item not received or significantly not as described. You'll probably see a lot of these guys are more commonly like on the eBay front, right? This happens to a lot of people that sell on eBay. So,
yeah,
you know, it's real. And the misperceptions and the fear of fraud can cause retailers to overreact and turn away good orders. So considering like cross-border purchases and thinking about it from orders coming from outside a merchant's home country arrive with the fear of the known, right? These are customers and merchants, you know, most likely have not seen before. And still, it turns out the percentage of fraud in domestic and cross-border orders is virtually the same. It's 90 basis points, or sorry, too geeky. 0.9% of orders is going to be fraud, right? So wow, it's almost on the same path. But the way that retailers treat those orders is not the same. In fact, merchants turn away 6.8% of cross-border orders for fear of fraud. And you want to compare that to the common number that from CyberSource's benchmark report, it's like 2.9%. So it's more than double, right? Yeah. And just because you're not too sure, you don't know, and you're like, is this really a good order or not? And I think that causes more issues than just like, hey, the loss of revenue today, right? It means that, hey, your customer is now potentially going to your competitor. One, right? And then that competitor is seeing revenue not today, but a lot of times people want to look at it from the lifetime value of a customer, right? So yeah, for some reason, I'm a camera manufacturer, DSLR manufacturer, and I buy the $600 orders for the main camera unit. Down the road, you're probably doing remarketing and retargeting ads to say, hey, you bought this camera, consider buying a tripod, or consider buying this new lens, or consider buying this bag because you're about to travel. It's summertime, right? And you can do on-target, in-the-moment messaging based on time, seasonality, or where they are in the process of the journey itself. And I think, you know, when looking at that, most people figure out, hey, that's not just $600 today that's put at risk, but it's also, you know, $1,200 for this year, another $2,400 for next year, as they continue on the journey itself and in that specific pitch. And that's just one area to look at it.
That's a good point. That's a you know, great insight there. It really brings to about the importance for companies to really have an understanding of their risk, their risk aversion versus their risk tolerance, because a lot of companies come into international really, with a very low risk tolerance when. The reason I bring that up is there's an example of a customer that I spoke with that was getting 40 international orders per week, but they were also getting about 4 of those that were fraudulent. And in their mind, those 4 fraudulent orders were enough to shut it down. They weren't seeing the bigger picture of, you're getting, international orders that you would have never had in the first place. Certainly you do have some that are fraudulent, but you need to see it from a bigger picture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like, this is super geeky, but I always take a look at like the analytics itself. Most people have Google Analytics installed on their store. And if you're looking at it, you can actually sit there and pull it apart and look at your audience and do it by geo and see what percentage of traffic is coming from which countries, right?
Yeah.
And look at it from your conversion rate. And I think there's always a risk of customer experience because there are nuances that people don't really understand about each country. And I think Zonos does a great job of actually helping out with those nuances, especially with like duties, taxes, landed costs, right? Those important aspects, because you don't want a surprise to come up for the customer where they're like, wait, you're charging me how much? Like, I thought the product was only $100, but now you're adding all these extra costs into it. And Zonos helps solve for that to set expectations correctly. And the other side of the coin is just the challenge looking at it from customer experience, right? Not only the risk of losing the customer experience today, but the conversion could be from a standpoint of like, hey, this person is now requiring me to create an account. Like, yes, you're trying to verify or check it in some way, but it's troublesome. Like personally for me, when I shop online, I don't ever want to create a customer account. I expect guest checkout to be there right off the bat. And if I like you guys enough, I maybe might create an account so I can get, some of the deals that you guys are promising later on down the road through email marketing, right?
That's true. Let's talk a little bit about managing fraud as part of your brand. And that kind of goes in line with, understanding that risk is just part of business, right? And that fraud is going to be a piece of that puzzle that you're going to have to figure out. Do you have anything that you'd like to say around that area? Yeah,
I mean, so there's, like, as I mentioned before, there's like the fraudulent transactions, right? You can sit there and evaluate the orders. What we do is basically provide an automated version, a decision within 200, 400 milliseconds to say like, hey, ship it out, don't worry about it. And that's a good way to take a look at it, right? You don't want to build an entire organization just to manage orders. You want to focus on your core so that you can deliver the best customer experience overall. But I think a good way to look at it is one very popular brand, have to anonymize, I'm trying to think of but like with their product itself, they get a ton of cross-border orders. And for them specifically, it's not necessarily the fraud itself, but the customer abuse that they're seeing, right? This item is not as described, and it was just simply an issue or an error with the sizing between them, right? So like, I don't know if you've ever bought anything from another country, but the sizing is vastly different. So like like a small here, I fit a small in the US, but I can fit a large in Asia. So that always like challenges me when I purchase things. And I think the inverse is true also when you're trying to target APAC or specifically China, just because it's growing at such a rapid rate. That is where essentially your lowest hanging fruit is. That can hurt the brand dramatically, right? And then if you're not able to deal with those issues, or there are other issues in the checkout process, or the confirmation order doesn't come through, right? Because you're still reviewing the order because it's an international order, it causes a lot of challenges in that area, right? And brand then goes into like, people go onto social media and they start talking about it, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, what have you. And talking about just influencers in general, right? If someone talks about this specific makeup palette online, what we see is a huge flash of just different countries coming onto that site, making purchases because that's trendy. And funnily enough, America, while we're still a global power, we still lead the trends on kind of what's cool and what's hot in today in the global world itself.
How does, things like flash sales, you've got now these pop-up shops and things like that kind of are kind of increasing on different web platforms. How does that affect fraud activity? Does that seem to be kind of an increase in fraud, being that there's, that it's so quick to a movie, you've got hundreds of transactions happening within just a few minutes. That seemed like kind of an area of increased fraudulent activity.
Yeah, it's a great point you bring up. So I know I've participated in flash sales. I'm sure a lot of you guys have too, right? It's a very limited time. You have 30 minutes to take advantage of a segment discount or a deal where it's a limited item. And so as a merchant, you'll receive thousands of orders in a very short period of time, right? And unfortunately for most merchants, flash sales lead to a certain number of chargeback, but also a number of false positive where legitimate customers are being declined, just simply because the merchant doesn't have the time to analyze every single questionable order, right? And the losses are even greater if the flash sale is for a limited edition item because the resale price on the gray market can be significantly higher than the price during the flash sale itself. Sadly enough, this encourages even the legitimate customers to buy more than they can afford and then turn around and claim they never received the shipment or even placed the order. And so with our machine learning team and the analyst team focused specifically on flash sale patterns, the real answer for accepting all the right orders and correctly identifying the fraudulent ones, including those in account takeover, really help out for a lot of folks. So usually they'll give us a heads up and like, hey, we're about to do a flash sale, just figure out what's going on. When we look at our algorithm itself, it's built on actual chargeback data. So when we see customer abuse, we can actually help fight customers. So theoretically, it's not the typical fraud that most people expect, but fight the chargebacks for item not received, significantly not as described, provide the case so that way their payment processing rates don't increase. That's
very cool. Can you provide us some keys to minimizing risk with cross-border e-commerce?
I think there are a couple of risks you have to look at today, especially in the cross-border space. I know we touched on this a little bit before, but risk of friction in customer experience, risk of losing your customer to a competitor, and just risk of dilution of the brand, and so on and so on and so on. So consumers' expectations are changing, especially with the need of instant gratification, right? We all get those dopamine hits when we get a notification from our smartphone, and sadly enough, or I guess coincidentally enough, Amazon just announced same-day delivery.
I saw that. That's crazy.
So, retailers have been looking for ways to combat this and provide competitive differentiators like BOPIS, flash sales that we talked about previously, but anything they can do to provide a more seamless customer experience. And the fear we talked about previously drives quite a bit of friction in the customer experience, which is the ultimate priority for most folks to excel in this business, right? 37% of shoppers who abandoned their carts told the Bayman Institute that they did this because the site wanted them to create an account, right? So that's a risk of just losing conversions overall, right? You have a conversion funnel and they didn't even get to checkout. They're just like right there, it's in the cart, average orders there. You probably upsold and cross-sold them with like different aspects inside your site. And they're like, I got to create an account. This is going to take too long.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really what it is. Yeah.
And it's a challenge, right? People are frustrated by the need to remember those countless login credentials for various web service and stores and what have you. And I know personally, I hate it. I mean, I think the most common password people use is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what happens is when you use something like that, that allows for account takeover, which then someone steals that account, steals your other accounts, and they can activate all the accounts at once and just ship a ton of orders into different places, typically drop sites, right? Which we see a bunch of. So, as a individual merchant, you might not see that, but with Signifyd, since we have that network effect in place, we see all those accounts coming in. We're like, okay, this is a fraud ring attacking based on stolen information that they might have pulled from the dark web itself.
Wow.
And then, the other thing is just the personalization, right? 28% of shoppers who abandoned their carts said checkout took too long or was too complicated. I think this just really ties back to what Zonos does, right? Simplifying that process internationally for merchants based on a localized experience for each geographical region, right? And I mean, even just in the US, we have geographical regions, right? I think when I first heard kitty corner for the first time was when I was in the Northeast and I had no idea what anybody was talking about. And someone had explained it to me and I was like, oh, you mean diagonal? And they're like, no, yeah, same thing. And I was just like, well, I didn't know that, right? But now take that outside of just the US and expand that out to EU, APAC, South Africa, Australia, and it can be very, very convoluted and pose risks for the business itself.
Yeah, so this kind of highlights the importance of, I think a lot of merchants expect global to be a one-size-fits-all. And just as you've highlighted in the things that you've mentioned, that you really need to do your homework and lean on experts to really guide you to the best channels, the best areas to focus your efforts and your marketing and how to best market internationally. You mentioned friendly fraud, account takeover. What are some other popular fraud techniques that you see today that are affecting merchants?
So stolen financials is the type of fraud that every fraud analyst was trained on, and this is commonly referred to as like online credit card fraud. So think of this: if you're at a gas station, you drop your credit card, someone picks it up, they can probably figure out your zip code from that area. And it's something similar in other geographies. Of course, there are different payment nuances in every geography, right? Some people do cash on delivery, so you want to be cognizant of those as well. But for most of us, our credit card information is available on the dark web for about $1.50, right? And if you're more on the wealthier side, it's going to just be a little bit more. But this still makes up the bulk of fraud for the cross-border realm, right? So a growing fraud activity related to stolen financials is rerouting. So when fraudsters look at it and they place an order, they want their transactions to be approved with like matching billing and shipping addresses, right?
Yeah.
As people put that as the hard restriction in the checkout process itself, even inside the US. So what they'll do is they'll reroute the delivery to one of their drop sites after the order has been approved and shipped. They just call the distributor, or sorry, the shipping company that does logistics and be like, oh, hey, sorry, I want to ship it to my office, for example, right? I won't be at home at 4 o'clock. I'll still be at work, so I'll just get it from there, right? But let's say these guys are a little bit more bold. They're going to ship straight to the drop site itself. Another is just IP spoofing or IP masking. So most people, they see an IP address and simply want to map the IP address to the shipping location to verify the buyers where you expect them to be. But for some time now, like fraudsters have been able to mask their IP address and show an IP address that looks perfect to the merchant, right? They're like, okay, this is what I expect to see. Okay, looks good, legitimate. Wow. So instead of actually just pinging the IP address, what you want to do is ping its nearest server, because that will quickly reveal where the buyer's device is actually physically located at. So when a cardholder has a billing and shipping an IP address inside Hong Kong, but you ping the nearest server and it's showing Russia or Korea, you know something's off, right? Really big in the luxury goods market, right? Think super expensive handbags and so on.
Yeah, wow, that's great information.
Yeah, it's always fun. I mean, at the end of the day, I think building walls doesn't really keep out fraud. It keeps the buyers out, right? I think the most common thing that most people do is like a credit card verification process that requires consumers to authenticate with their banks, just to see as a way for merchants to protect themselves. But in the end, it just causes a lot of frustrations for customers and drives them away from your site. They go to someone else.
Okay. Perfect. That's great information, Chris. We appreciate all of that. Is there anything that anything else you would like to share with us around Signifyd or with fraud before we jump into a little bit of Q&A?
Yeah. If you look at Signifyd from a perspective of like, okay, Signifyd does well in the U.S. You guys are based in the U.S. We have offices in San Jose, Denver, New York, and then we have a Belfast and UK office as well. So okay. That provides some context for a lot of folks. But if you look at like the transaction data itself, right, and how we help vet it and use elastic linking and just the data from customers across the board, looking at our sample set, we have 45% of over $1 billion worth of transactions just in Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and then that was guaranteed. Another 36% in Europe, another 19% in APAC. So a lot of times you might have not seen the customer before, but we have some sort of insight into how they perform or they transacted and their behaviors as well on websites.
Okay, thanks. I know that Signifyd has some great products for SMB up to large enterprise organizations. So that's great that they could really start at any level, depending on where they're at with you all. From a strategy point, I've got a question here. What would be recommended as a strategy for a merchant that is just getting started with international e-commerce, like simple things they can do to minimize fraud from perhaps their side?
Yeah, I mean, so I would take a look at it from a standpoint of where your strongest champions are, right? These are people that really believe in your product, and this works differently across a lot of industries. A lot of times, just looking at the ABS CVV matches inside the payment gateway itself would help out, and then just understanding where they sit. You know, I mentioned before the IP pinging the nearest server rather than the IP address will kind of give you some insights as well, making the transaction a little bit smoother, right? Rather than just looking at it overall. A lot of times people put in whitelist after like you have repeat buyers, the whitelist just makes it a little bit easier. So that way, if you have one customer service rep looking at orders today, you hire a new one and you just have some sort of documentation, it makes things a little bit easier across the board.
Yeah. You know, we speak with merchants that want to really just open up to the world, and others that want to do it more strategically, country by country. Do you see a benefit in either of those strategies as far as international growth from a fraud perspective, or is it it just depends on how prepared you are? I would imagine. Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so we look at it from a standpoint of we remove the fear of going into new markets, but you still gotta have the logistics,
Yeah.
which is a little bit of a challenge. I think Zonos does a great solve for that specifically. So if you work with Zonos already, then yeah, I think you can open up to the world. You do want to tailor your messaging a little bit as well and just take that into consideration. So a good case and example is I speak Mandarin Chinese, but I learned it from my father. And so when I went back to Taiwan, for example, and I was speaking, no accent, no problems. They couldn't tell I was from the US. But the downside was when I was talking to someone, they told me, you sound like a 70-year-old man, because I was using the equivalent of swell, right? Which no one uses anymore. I don't know what the cool words are in today's day and age for kids these days, but I just sound like a 70-year-old man when I was talking to folks.
You're speaking all formal, like saying, hello, sir, instead of like, hey, what's up? You know?
Yeah, more like my slang was sounding like a 70-year-old man.
Oh, okay. Got another question here. We don't have that much time, but we'll just have one more question. It says, do you have any extreme stories of how fraud influenced the business, or maybe a scenario where you were able to make a big change with an organization, a success story, or?
Yeah. So I was working with the tea manufacturer. I thought this was relatively interesting. And so in November, they got hit with about $60,000 in chargebacks. December got hit with $90,000 in chargebacks. January was another $40,000 in chargebacks. They came to a point where they were just like, we can't do this anymore. They literally shut down they didn't shut down the entire site. You could still scroll through it, but the checkout process was shut down. You couldn't even transact. You couldn't buy if you wanted to. The brand itself, if you go to a grocery store and you look on the shelves, they carry the brands, right? They're trying to go direct to consumer for the first time, which I thought was interesting. A lot of brands are doing this as well, right? A lot of manufacturers, they want to get more data about their consumers so they can actually build products or new offerings that resonate with the consumer itself. And that data is super helpful based on how they navigate this site and go around it. But they literally had to shut down the website because they were just taking such a strong hit. With Signifyd in place, they were just like, okay, no longer getting attacked by organized fraud ring, right? They had the shields up. We were able to figure it out and put that at rest for them. But more importantly, the transactions that they were declining when they were trying to move into Canada actually made it increase on their top line by 15%.
Wow, that's huge. That's huge. We appreciate your time. Looks like we're just coming up on 30 minutes, so we'll end here. But we appreciate your time, Chris. Thank you for sharing all of the details and information and insight around fraud and how to protect yourselves as merchants. Chris's contact information is here, so you can feel free to jump on their website and learn more about how Signifyd can help you. My contact information is here as well. Again, we appreciate it, Chris. Thanks for your time. You have a great weekend.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you guys again so much. Feel free to ping me about any weird use cases. Happy to help out and take a deeper look.
Sounds great. Thank you. Take care.
Have a good one, guys.